Have you ever like wondered how a president can just like make these big changes without going through Congress?
Yeah.
You know, like enact sweeping policies?
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're diving into today on the deep dive. Executive orders.
Yeah.
You, our awesome listeners, shared some really great sources with us for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We've got the Constitution Center, which will give us that historical viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Wikipedia, just for like general knowledge.
Yep.
We've got the ACLU, so we can get that civil liberties perspective.
Important.
And of course, the American Bar Association. Okay. The legal perspective.
Of course.
So our mission today is to kind of like unpack what these orders are,
Right.
where this power comes from, what a president can and can't do with these orders,
Yeah.
and why it all matters.
Absolutely. It's a really fascinating area.
Yeah.
It's, when we talk about executive orders, we're talking about essentially written instructions from the president, and they guide the executive branch. And, they carry a weight similar to federal law.
So it's almost like they're making law, even though they're not Congress.
Well, and that's exactly it. This isn't a power that's actually explicitly laid out in the Constitution.
Oh, interesting.
It's fascinating. It's developed over time.
Okay.
Through historical practice, how presidents have interpreted their own role, and really importantly, what the courts have said about it.
So it's almost like this gray area that's developed over time.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit murky.
Interesting.
But yeah, we'll definitely unpack all of that.
That's cool.
And, for, someone like you who's really, interested in getting to the bottom of things,
Yeah.
I think you'll find this deep dive really interesting.
Cool.
We've got some really surprising insights.
Awesome.
And we won't get too bogged down in like all the technical language.
Okay, so let's start with the Constitution.
Sure.
When we talk about like the basis for executive orders, where does the Constitution actually mention them? Because when I was like reading through it, that term didn't exactly jump out at me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The Constitution itself doesn't actually use the term executive order. So it's kind of implied.
Okay.
And it comes from really, a couple key sections in Article 2.
Okay.
The first one being Section 1 of Article 2, which is the one that gives the president the executive power. So
like their responsibility to run the executive branch?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just their fundamental responsibility to actually run things.
Okay.
And then there's Section 3 of that same article. And that requires the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
So they have to make sure that the laws Congress passes actually happen.
Yeah, basically they have to make sure that everything's actually implemented, and that's considered the primary source of their power to issue executive orders.
So it's less about the Constitution saying, here's the power to make executive orders.
Right.
And it's more about the Constitution laying out the responsibilities.
Exactly.
And the president needing a way to fulfill those.
Yeah, and it's almost like, if you're a manager, you need to give your team instructions in order to get a project done.
Right. Yeah, to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Absolutely.
So Congress makes the laws, and that's like the project plan.
Right, exactly, like the big overall plan.
Yeah.
And then those laws need specific instructions to actually be put into action.
Yeah, like how to actually carry them out.
Exactly. And the president, as head of the executive branch, issues those instructions through executive orders to all the different federal agencies and officials.
Like delegating.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about delegation.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that this power isn't a blank check.
Right, there have to be limits.
Exactly. And a really pivotal moment in defining those limits was the Supreme Court case Youngstown Sheet and Tube Covey Sawyer back in 1952.
The steel mill seizure case.
That's the one.
What was the main takeaway from that for executive orders?
Well, it really established that a president just can't act unilaterally.
Okay.
Their power has to come from either an act of Congress or directly from the Constitution.
So there has to be that grounding.
Exactly. They can't just make stuff up.
Okay.
So in this case, President Truman tried to seize control of the steel mills during a labor dispute.
Right, because it's during the Korean War.
Yeah, exactly.
They're worried about steel production.
Exactly, and the Supreme Court ended up striking down that order.
Interesting.
And the really important part of that ruling was Justice Hugo Black, who was writing for the majority.
Right.
Stated that the president's power to issue such an order must stem either from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself.
So they have to point back to some kind of legal basis.
Exactly. Yeah, it has to be grounded in something.
Okay, so the president can't just dream up some power and say, okay, I'm doing this now.
Exactly. They can't just make it up as they go along.
Interesting.
But there is another way that presidents can legitimately use executive orders.
Right.
And this was highlighted in the Constitution Center's source. And that's when Congress specifically gives the president the power to do something.
Okay, so Congress is delegating.
Exactly. Yeah, they're basically saying, hey, Mr. President, we want you to handle this.
Okay.
And you can use executive orders to do it.
Interesting.
A really good example of this is in immigration law.
Okay.
It's in Title 8 of the U.S. Code, Section 1182.
What does that say?
Well, this is where Congress has given the president the power to suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens if they think it's detrimental to the national interest.
So Congress is saying, we trust you to make this judgment call, Mr. President?
Exactly, and they're giving him the power to do that.
Okay.
Through an executive order.
So Congress can say, you handle this, we give you the authority.
Yeah, they can delegate that power.
Interesting.
And it can even go a step further.
How so?
Well, if Congress actually likes what a president does with an executive order, they can actually formally approve it by writing the text of that order into an actual law.
Oh, so they can codify it.
Exactly, yeah. They can make it super official.
So it's almost like they're retroactively saying, yes, we approve of this action.
Exactly. And it makes it much more permanent and difficult to overturn.
That's a really cool example of how the branches can work together.
Yeah, it is. It's a good illustration of the system of checks and balances.
Now, in the Youngstown case, Justice Frankfurter also had a concurring opinion.
He did.
So what was his view on presidential power?
Well, in his opinion, he really focused on the president's role in foreign relations.
Okay.
And he called it a vast share of responsibility for the conduct of our foreign relations.
So he saw the president as having a lot of power in that area.
Exactly, yeah. And that comes directly from the Constitution.
Okay.
And this is really relevant to executive orders because the president uses them a lot to shape foreign policy.
So even though Youngstown put some limits on presidential power domestically,
Right.
it also acknowledged that there are areas where the president has more power.
Exactly. Yeah, especially in foreign affairs.
Okay, so we've covered the basis for executive orders, the implied powers from Article 2,
Yes.
and then the powers that Congress can directly give to the president.
Right.
But what about the limits on this power?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Can a president just do whatever they want with an executive order?
Absolutely not. There are definitely limitations.
Okay.
So, as the Constitution Center explained, even though an executive order can have the force of law, Congress can always pass a new law to override it.
So they can basically say, we don't like what you did, Mr. President. We're going to change it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's especially true if the original executive order was based on powers that Congress had given to the president in the first place.
Right. So if Congress is like, we delegated this power to you, and you're not using it the way we want.
Yeah, exactly. Then
Yeah.
they can step in and rewrite the rules. Now, it is important to note that Congress can't actually directly revoke an executive order.
Okay.
That's based on one of the president's exclusive constitutional powers.
So if the president is acting within their own inherent powers,
Right.
Congress can't just come in and say, nope, that's gone.
Exactly.
So what can they do then?
Well, they have to use other tools, like they might withhold funding from programs that were created by the executive order.
Oh, so they use the power of the purse.
Exactly. They use their control over the money.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a pretty effective lever.
What about the courts? What's their role in all this?
Oh, the courts are super important.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really the ultimate referees when it comes to these kinds of power struggles.
They make sure everyone's playing
Yeah,
fair.
exactly. Yeah, they make sure everyone's staying within the lines.
Okay.
And the Youngstown case is a perfect example of that.
Right, because the courts struck down the order.
Exactly.
days.
It is, yeah. But President Trump actually surpassed that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in early March of 2025, he'd already issued 89 executive orders since taking office in January.
Wow.
So he was on track to issue even more than FDR in his early days.
That's really interesting.
It is, yeah. It shows how much presidents rely on this tool these days.
Okay, so let's move on to some specific examples of what executive orders have actually done and their impact on American society.
Right.
How have they changed things?
Well, executive orders have been responsible for some really major policy changes.
Like what?
Well, a really great example is President Truman's Executive Order 9981.
What did that do?
Well, it desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a huge step towards equality.
And that was in 1948.
Yeah,
So it had a massive impact on American society.
it did. Yeah.
Now, we've talked about some of the limits of executive orders
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that they can be controversial.
Right.
Are there any specific examples of executive orders that have been particularly controversial?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, which ones?
Well, two of FDR's executive orders are often cited as being really controversial.
Okay, which ones?
So there's Executive Order 6102.
What was that?
That one required all U.S. citizens to hand over their gold to the Federal Reserve.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a pretty big deal.
Okay.
And then there was Executive Order 9066.
And what did that one do?
Well, that's the one that authorized the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
Right.
It actually also impacted some non-citizen Germans and Italians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a really dark chapter in American history.
Yeah, the internment of Japanese Americans is a really stark reminder
It is.
of how executive power could be misused.
Absolutely. It's a really sobering thought.
And it shows how important those checks and balances are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to make sure that power is never concentrated in one place.
Okay. What are some other controversial orders?
Well, more recently, there was President George W. Bush's Executive Order 13233.
What did that do?
That one placed restrictions on public access to presidential papers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that generated a lot of criticism because people were concerned about transparency.
Right.
And that order was actually later revoked by President Obama.
Okay.
And the Heritage Foundation has also raised concerns about executive orders.
What are their concerns?
Well, they're worried that presidents are increasingly using executive orders to bypass Congress.
So they're making law without going through the legislative process.
Exactly, and they argue that that undermines the separation of powers.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic of debate.
Now, it's not like these orders are always accepted without question.
I don't know, definitely not.
There have been legal challenges.
Yeah, all the time.
Okay, so what are some examples of that?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court did strike down some of FDR's early New Deal executive orders.
Right.
And that really showed that presidential power has limits.
Even during a crisis.
Exactly, even then.
Okay.
And more recently, there was President Clinton's executive order on strikebreakers.
What was that about?
Well, it was aimed at preventing the federal government from doing business with companies that hired permanent replacements for workers who were on strike.
Okay.
And a federal appeals court actually struck that down.
Why?
They said it conflicted with existing labor law.
So even though executive orders have the force of law,
Right.
they can still be overturned.
Exactly. Yeah, if they go too far.
If they exceed the president's authority or if they conflict with laws passed by Congress.
Exactly.
And Congress also has ways to respond right.
They do, yeah.
Even if they can't directly overturn an order that's based on the president's inherent powers.
Right.
So what can they do?
Well, they can pass a new law that basically cancels out the executive order.
Okay, so they can legislate around it.
Exactly.
But of course, the president could veto that new law.
That's right.
And then Congress would need a supermajority to override the veto.
Exactly. Yeah, it can get pretty complicated.
That's a whole process.
It is.
Are there any examples of Congress trying to push back against executive orders?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What's one?
Well, the House of Representatives actually sued President Obama.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they claimed that he'd gone too far in implementing parts of the Affordable Care Act.
So they were saying he was exceeding his executive authority.
Exactly.
Wow.
And we also saw those big legal challenges to President Trump's travel ban,
Right.
which a federal court initially blocked, but then the Supreme Court ultimately upheld.
So again, it shows how the courts are involved in all of this.
Exactly. Yeah, they're always there to interpret the law and make sure everyone's following the rules.
Okay, now one last area I wanted to touch on
Sure.
is the president's power to direct independent federal agencies.
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one
It is, yeah.
because these agencies are supposed to be independent.
Right.
but the president still has some authority over them.
So how does that work?
Well, it's a bit of a gray area.
Oh,
Some executive orders specifically say that they don't apply to independent agencies,
okay.
but others don't.
So it's not always clear.
Exactly, and that leads to a lot of debate about how much control the president actually has.
Are there any specific examples of this?
Well, Executive Order 112866.
What's that one about?
That one requires agencies to do a cost-benefit analysis for certain regulations.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of debate about whether that applies to independent agencies.
So it's an ongoing issue.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive,
It's okay.
I wanted to ask about presidential proclamations.
Sure.
Wikipedia mentioned those briefly.
Right.
How are those different from executive orders?
Well, proclamations are more about, like, stating a condition or declaring a law or recognizing an event, whereas executive orders are more about directing the executive branch.
Okay.
So proclamations are often aimed at people outside the government,
Got it.
like the general public,
Okay.
while executive orders are more internal.
So they have different audiences,
Exactly.
but can they both have the force of law?
Yes, they can.
So in terms of their legal impact, they could be similar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially if the proclamation is based on authority given to the president by Congress.
Okay, so like if Congress says, Mr. President, you have the power to declare a national emergency,
Right.
and then the president issues a proclamation declaring a national emergency,
Yeah,
that can trigger certain legal powers.
exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a really powerful tool.
So just to summarize, executive orders are a way for the president to take action without needing a view from Congress.
Right.
But they are limited by the Constitution
Yeah.
and by laws passed by Congress. And of course, the courts are there to make sure everything stays within the lines.
Exactly.
So it's a complex system.
It is.
But it's designed to prevent any one person or branch from having too much power.
Right. It's all about balance.
And for you, our listener,
Yeah.
you know, you're clearly interested in how our government works.
Yeah.
And this power of executive orders is constantly evolving.
It is. Yeah, it's always changing.
And it's often debated.
Definitely.
And it really makes you think about the balance of power.
It does, yeah.
You know, given how often presidents are using executive orders these days and all the legal and political debates about them,
Right.
what does this all mean for the future of our government?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
You know, how is this going to affect how decisions are made?
Yeah.
And how is it going to affect, you know, the average citizen?
Exactly.
It's something to really think about.
It is.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive
It has.
into the world of executive orders.
Definitely.
Hopefully this has given you a better understanding of this presidential power
Yeah,
and how it fits into our system of checks and balances.
absolutely.
Now, if you're interested in learning more, check out the websites of the National Archives,
Good resource.
the American Presidency Project,
Yeah.
or the Constitution Center.
Lots of great information there.
And join us next time as we explore another fascinating corner of our government.
I can't wait.
See you then.